Hello everyone, my name is John DeBella, Vice President of Marketing and Sales, and on behalf of Simulations Plus, I welcome you to today's webinar, which will focus on the exciting new features and capabilities in ADMET Predictor 7.2. Michael Lawless, Business Development Manager, Cheminformatics Solutions, will be presenting today. An opportunity to ask questions will follow Michael's presentation. You may either send your question using the questions pane on your control panel, or you may ask your question directly using the hand-raising icon. If you're using a telephone to listen to the call, please be sure to enter the unique audio PIN displayed when you join the call. When you enter your audio PIN, this enables us to unmute your line so that you can be heard. This webinar is being recorded for playback at our website, www.simulations-plus.com. Also, upon request, the presentation slides can be made available and shared with colleagues. It is now my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Michael. Michael?
Thank you, John. Well, good morning and welcome to the webinar. This slide is an outline of the talk. So first, I'm going to be talking a lot about liver microsomes, and so I'll give some background on human liver microsomes. We've added two predictive models to ADMET Predictor 7.2. One is the S+fumic, which is a predictive model for the fraction unbound in liver microsomes, and then the other is called MET. It's in our metabolism module, HLM underscore total clearance, and it's a predictive model for human liver microsome unbound intrinsic clearance. So it uses this model to modify the data for the unbound fraction. And then we've also updated our 18 cytochrome P450 kinetics models. So these predict Km, Vmax, and clearance for the five major drug metabolizing isoforms of cytochrome P450. And there's also a model for 3A4 HLMs. The other ones are recombinant. And then John's going to talk a little bit about our improved integration with GastroPlus and PBPK models there. And then in the final section, I'll discuss the KNIME workflow that was updated for ADMET Predictor 7.2. So this section just discusses the HLM background. So what are HLMs? So these are microsomes. Microsomes are vesicle-like artifacts from endoplasmic reticulum. So they're spherical shaped particles. Typically, there's a lipid bilayer on the outside. There's going to be a hydrophobic head, and then on the interior, this is a hydrophobic tail, and they form this bilayer. Typically, there's a phosphate group that's a charged head group, positively charged head group, and then an alkyl chain. So to create microsomes or concentrate microsomes, you homogenize livers from different donors. One of the companies that sells microsomes, I looked up on the internet, and they had like 100 different donors. And the reason you want to do this is you want kind of an average representation of the different isoforms of cytochrome P450. And we all have slightly different expression levels, so this kind of equilibrates it over the different donors. So you would put this homogenized livers into a centrifuge, spin it around. If you spin at 10,000 Gs, then the cytochrome P450 will remain in the solution, and you can separate that from the pellet. Then you take the solution and spin it down at even faster rate, 100,000 Gs. This will contain the endoplasmic reticulum, which also contains the CYPs as a pellet, and then this can be frozen and then thawed out when you're ready to do the experiments. So for using HLMs for drug metabolism, all the CYP isoforms will be present in the metabolisms, or in the microsome. So that's one advantage of using this rather than recombinant CYPs, which only contain a single one. You need to add NADPH to your test media because this is consumed by the reductase and will keep the cytochrome P450s will keep oxidizing the molecules. Also, if UGTs will be present in microsomes, and if you want to study phase 2 conjugation, you need to add UDPGA, which is the substrate, or contains the substrate that gets transferred to the test compound. And so HLMs are used in drug metabolism in the early stages to kind of weed out candidates that would be metabolized quickly, and then in later stages you might use it for PBPK modeling and trying to predict in vivo clearance. So how is HLM stability measured? I list 2 methods here. One is determine Km and Vmax and then convert that to the intrinsic clearance. And then another method called the in vitro half-life technique measures the half-life of the compound and then converts that to intrinsic clearance. And this is where most of the data came from for our HLM clearance model. So with the in vitro T1/2 method, you isolate your test compound with the mixture, and then at specific time intervals you would take an aliquot out of the mixture and analyze it for the percent test compound remaining. This is simply a ratio of the peak height at the particular time compared to an internal standard. Next, you plot the natural logarithm of the percent remaining versus time, and the slope of this line will be the equilibrium constant, or the rate constant K, and then the in vitro T1/2 is 0.693, which is the natural logarithm of 2 divided by K. And so in this graph, I just show some data from one of our NCE compounds, SLP0012, that we had tested at the absorption system. So at time, on the y-axis is the ln of the percent remaining versus time, and so they pulled out aliquots at 10 minutes, 20 minutes, around 30, and then 60, and then the slope of this line is minus K. And then you can use this to create you can use this equation to compute the clearance from the T1/2, and you also need to know the concentration of the microsome. So this is the inverse of the concentration, so milligrams of microsomal protein per milliliter of incubation. And so the units here would be milliliter per minute per milligram of microsomal protein. So these are the typical units. More commonly, you see this expressed as microliters. So it's not a fraction, essentially. You can also scale this up to the grams of liver. So you see this in the literature, maybe that they'll represent the clearance per gram of liver. Here's one conversion factor, 45 milligrams of microsomal protein per gram of liver. This can vary, and I think when John shows one of the panels, we use 38, I think is the default in GastroPlus. This 45 comes from Obach's article down here. You can also scale it up to kilograms of body weight. Typically there's 20 grams of liver per kilogram of body weight, and then using this equation you would get your clearance in milliliter per minute per kilogram body weight. A typical liver size is 1,500 grams, and the way you would get that is 20 grams per liver times a 70 kilogram human would be about 1,400. So an experiment or a publication in 2002, Austin measured clearance and varied the microsomal concentration. And as you can see, for some compounds, the clearance is highly dependent upon the microsomal concentration. So if we look at estemazole, we see that at low microsomal concentration, it has a very high clearance, and then as you increase the microsomal concentration, the clearance decreases. While for other compounds, such as indapamide, it stays pretty constant across the microsomal concentration. So there's clearly dependence of the clearance on the microsomal concentration. So why might this be? So what is happening here is non-specific binding to the microsome. So if we look at a particularly basic lipophilic compound, tamoxifen, Here we predicted the pKa to be 8.5, so it's got this basic nitrogen here, and then a very high log P, 6.6, predicted by ADMET Predictor. And you can imagine this group is fairly hydrophobic. And then the experimental FUmic, fraction unbound to the microsomes, is 0.003. Again, and this comes from Austin. So only the compounds that are solution and free from the membrane can interact with the enzyme and therefore be metabolized. So only the unbound fraction is actually interacting with the substrate. And so you need to correct the terms, the clearance for that. So this is the equation to correct it. So the unbound intrinsic clearance equals the apparent clearance from the experiment divided by the fraction unbound to the liver microsomes. And FUmic also varies with microsomal concentration, and you can use this equation to calculate the fraction unbound at concentration 2 based on the fraction unbound at concentration 1 using this equation. Okay. So you can kind of standardize the fraction unbound. So Austin noticed a trend between log P and log D and the fraction unbound in microsomes. So in this equation, C is the concentration of the microsomal protein, and then he fitted that to log P/D equation here. And the log P, log D is either the log D of the compound or the log P of the compound. It's the log D for neutral and acidic compounds and log P for basic compounds. So log P is always greater than log D. So for lipophilic or basic compounds, these can interact with the charged head group, with the negatively charged head group. I think before I incorrectly said positively charged in the microsome. But the basic group can form a salt bridge with the head group and therefore increase the binding. So the FUmic will be lower for a basic compound given the same, let's say log P. And basic compounds are defined as having a basic pKa above 7.4. Acids are defined as having a pKa below 7.4 using these equations. And then later on, Halifax and Houston modified, kind of looked at the relationship between log P and FUmic and noticed that it wasn't a linear relationship, so they introduced this quadratic term here in their approximation. So if we simply look at the Austin approximation for fraction unbound to microsomes and graph that versus log P, log D, you would get a plot like this. So at very hydrophilic compounds, there's very little bound fraction, so there's a high unbound fraction, so you're not adjusting the unbound clearance very much for these hydrophilic compounds. When you get kind of between a log PD of between 3, about 50% is bound and unbound, so you increase your unbound intrinsic clearance by 2 over the apparent clearance from the experiment. And then as you get down closer, a little bit above 4, you're at 10 times the unbound clearance versus the apparent clearance from the experiments. And then even when you get up higher here, you're correcting, maybe it'd be 100 times the intrinsic clearance from the experiment. So this can be very important for lipophilic compounds. So we created a fumic model in ADMET Modeler. Our data set comes from 15 publications. Some of these publications were simply QSAR models of FUmic, and they were using experimental data from previous articles or compilations. So most of the data sets in these 15 publications were fairly small, under 100 compounds, and there was a lot of redundant data because when the next publication come out, it would just use the values from the previous publication. Now, one exception to this was a publication from Hua Gao in 2008 when he was at Pfizer, and this used 1,223 molecules to create their FUmic model. This data is proprietary, so we couldn't use it in our model. The literature contains rat and human liver microsome fraction unbound. We use the human over the liver whenever possible, but in Austin's paper, he compares human, rat, and dog fraction unbound. They're fairly similar, so this wasn't a huge jump. Then we adjust all the FUmic values to 1 milligram per microsomal protein per milliliter concentration. Using the previous equation I showed, overall the data set contains 100 molecules in the training used to train the model and 14 in the external test set. So here's a comparison between the Austin method, Halifax, Houston, and our model based on the same data. And note that this is the raw value, so that I didn't logify the dependent variable in these. So if you look in these publications, you'll see a lot better correlation, but they're actually plotting a log-log plot, and this is just the raw data. Down here I show the statistics of the various methods. Our model has a little bit superior statistics over all of the different models. I want to point out that we concentrated on the root mean square of log error, and the reason we did this is because you really want to try and get these values down here as good as possible, because that's where it's going to make the biggest adjustment to the intrinsic clearance, the parent clearance. So this is the log error, and it's much more sensitive to smaller values, and so that's why we used it to kind of select our model. Okay, so moving on, now I'll discuss the HLM total clearance model in ADMET Predictor 7.2. So initially we queried the Kimball database for human liver microsome data, and then started curating it and creating some models. And what we noticed was that there was a lot of curation needed because some of the units that were put into Kimball weren't correct, and therefore the values were incorrect. So for each one of the compounds in our model, we obtained the original journal article, and we checked the values in the journal article compared to what was in the Kimball database. And while we were doing this, we also obtained the experimental microsome concentration if it was provided in the journal article. We converted all the data to microliter per minute per milligram of microsomal protein, and then we corrected this for the unbound fraction. We used our S+fumic model to predict FUmic at 1 milligram microsomal protein concentration, and then we converted this value to the FUmic that would correspond to the experimental value used in the journal article. If no experimental value was given, then we assumed the concentration was 0.5 milligrams per milliliter, and this is somewhat a standard. When we had our compounds tested at absorption system, that's what they used, and then extracting as much of the data as we could, that was typically the number used. Then we computed the unbound clearance by dividing the apparent clearance by FUmic, and so this is what we used to create our model. And dividing by FUmic really kind of spread the data out, so you had a larger range on the clearance values. These next two slides just show a little bit of data curation and some examples. So in this paper from Ferletti in Journal of Medicinal Chemistry, he gives the clearance for the microsomes and then scaled up clearance in kilograms of body weight. And so if we kind of focus on this number here, this 0.6, if you convert that to milliliters per milligram, you get 0.7, which is the value listed here. But you'll notice that the units really should be milliliter, not microliter, as shown that was in the journal article. So that's one kind of common mistake we saw. Now, typically, you'd see the opposite. You'd see milliliters when they actually meant microliters, and some of that is simply due to the fact that the mu symbol, you can just type an M and then convert it to a symbol font, and it'll come out as mu. And so that might be responsible for some of the errors in the journal articles. But typically, if you have a value in microliter per minute per milligram, it's going to be fairly close to the same value in milliliter per minute per kilogram body weight. This is simply the raw data from Kimball. So they show the clearance of this molecule as 0.024 milliliter per minute per kilogram body weight. If you look up the journal article, they show in the figure that it's 24 microliter per minute per milligram of microsomal protein. And I'm not sure how they reduce this by a factor of 1,000, but obviously there was something wrong in their conversion. Maybe they didn't know that you couldn't just convert from milligrams to kilograms by multiplying by 10 to the 6th, and that this is really microsomal protein compared to kilogram body weight. So there were a lot of problems in the Kimball value, so that's why we ended up extracting all the journal articles and verifying the results. So this kind of summarizes where we got the data for our model. The model data set contains 1,150 compounds from 123 journal articles published between 2004 and 2013. All the major pharmaceutical companies and other companies published the articles, so Abbott, AstraZeneca, BMS, Pfizer, etc. There are a large number of targets, 5-HT2C, 5-HT3, Abl kinase, TRPV1, chemokine receptors, etc. So we feel like there were a lot of different targets, and so it's a fairly diverse data set. Then this table is simply the list the journal and then the number of compounds extracted from each one of these. The majority of data points come from bioinorganic and medicinal chemistry letters and the Journal of Medicinal Chemistry. The number of records varies from 1 to 45, so the most we extracted was 45, and then so that was an average of 9.3 compounds per test article. Now, one thing I want to clarify is that all this data, the clearance was an exact number. So if the journal article said intrinsic clearance is less than, 10 microliter per minute per milligram of microsomal protein, we didn't use that because that's not a quantitative number. So all these were exact numbers. So this is just some distribution plots of the overall data set used to build the model. In the upper left-hand corner is the molecular weight distribution. So the minimum is 126, the maximum is 1312. So we did have some fairly large macrocyclic compounds in the data set, but they weren't a great deal. The average molecular weight was 420. So most of the compounds had a molecular weight below 500. So this bar here actually represents everything between 450 and 500. Then the logP distribution is given over in the right. The minimum is minus 0.1 and the maximum is 7.3. So a very hydrophobic compound here, and you can imagine the fraction unbound is very low for that compound. And then an average predicted logP of 3.5. Then in the lower left-hand corner is the S+fumic distribution, and this has been adjusted for the experimental microsomal concentration. So the minimum is 0.01. And I neglected to mention that for our model, we set a lower cap value, which is also a new feature in ADMET Predictor 7.2, to 0.011 for the model. So you never get a clearance or FUMIC below that, and then the maximum is 0.96 with an average of 0.49. So if the average being 0.49, that means the unbound intrinsic clearance would be twice as high as the experimental value. And then in the right-hand corner is the log of the unbound clearance distribution, and it varies from 0.53 to 4 with an average of 1.92. This next slide shows a graph of the observed clearance versus the predicted clearance, and then the line through there. So there were 977 compounds in the training set and 173 in the test set, and these are represented by these blue dots here. We get a root mean square error of 0.357 in the training set and 0.372 for the test set. So overall, the root mean square error was about 0.36, and that is a log value there. So we also added a CYP risk rule for clearance by, again, plotting the World Drug Index subset that we use for all of our ADMET risk rules. For this one, if the clearance is below 50, you're not penalized at all. So this is this red represented by this red line here, which uses this axis over here. So here's the clearance risk, and then when you get up to 50, we start ramping up the penalty, and then at 175, you're accessed a full penalty if the predicted clearance is above that. Values between 50 and 175 will have a variable clearance risk over here. Okay, so this slide represents the predictions in our metabolism module. And the reason I'm going over this at this point, I'm going to come back to the HLM data set, but I just want to kind of review for our metabolism module. The first thing we do is predict if a compound is a substrate of 9 different isoforms of cytochrome P450. If it is, then we'll predict the sites of metabolism, and then we can visualize the metabolites for that compound. So we have a CYP substrate model, sites of metabolism, and then for the sites of metabolism, we also predict the kinetic parameters, Km, Vmax, and clearance. And these are all rebuilt models for ADMET Predictor 7.2. We curated the data from each one of these data sets and rebuilt the 18 models. Okay. So now I'm going to use that information and switch back to the intrinsic clearance model. So one of our customers, Medivir, Ilva Terilius and Jonas Stallring, wanted to know a little bit more about the data set, and was it biased towards any particular CYP? And we didn't intentionally bias it. We just extracted the data from the various journal articles. And so this slide represents the predicted CYP isoform as a substrate. So for example, we did it for both the HLM training set and the World Drug Index subset. So we simply took all the molecules and predicted is it a substrate for 1A2? And so 65% of the molecules were not predicted to be a substrate for 1A2. And so if you compare these values to the between the two data sets, some of them are fairly similar, but you see that the 2C19 and the 3A4, have a higher percent of their compounds are predicted substrates for these two isoforms than in our WDI subset. Then when the next thing I did was take the intrinsic clearance model. So these are these RCYP models, and for each one of the compounds predicted the clearance for the 5 different isoforms, and then summed that up, and then took the individual isoforms and divided it by the sum to get the percent metabolism responsible for, or that was due to a particular isoform of cytochrome P450. And then I looked at the percent of compounds given a certain percent clearance. I think this is called fraction metabolized in John's slides that he'll show. So all of these should add up to 100. And what you see is that 50% of the compounds had a majority of their clearance from 3A4. In the World Drug Index, that was predicted to be 31%. And also what you'll notice is even though we predicted a large number of the compounds were substrates for 2C19, their clearances were not very high, which is kind of interesting. So the original question was, is this data set biased for any CYP? And if so, can it be used to predict clearance from where, it's where it's not metabolized majorly by 3A4. And so what I did is extracted some of the data points for 1A2, 2C9, 2D6, and plotted their predicted value versus the observed value in these plots, and also did it for 3A4. And what you can see is that, I know this is a little bit small, but the overall model, the RMSE was about 0.356, and if you look at compounds that are predicted to be cleared primarily by 1A2, the root mean square is 0.37. For compounds that were predicted to be mostly metabolized by 2C9, you get a little bit better root mean square error of about 0.258, and similarly for 2D9 or 2D6. So all these had similar statistics. So we feel that you can predict HLM clearance, even though it might not be might not be the major clearance pathway. Okay, so now switching gears and just showing the CYP Kinetic model. So all these models were rebuilt in ADMET Predictor 7.2, and what I'm plotting is the root mean square error for each one of the 18 models. The bars in blue are the ADMET Predictor 7.2. The bars in red are ADMET Predictor 7.1 is blue and 7.2 is red. And what you can see going across here is that most of the red bars are lower than the blue bars, indicating an improved model. There's a couple exceptions here. 2C9 KM, the root mean square error actually got worse. Here you can see that the KM is much better for 2C19 in ADMET Predictor 7.2. So overall, improvement in the root mean square error for these models. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to John, and he's going to discuss the integration of ADMET Predictor 7.2 in GastroPlus. John?
Okay, thanks, Mike. One of the things that we had spent a lot of time doing over the last few years is promoting this marriage between QSAR and PBPK modeling. PBPK being physiologically based pharmacokinetics. If you click next, Michael, one of the things that we had done or were able to do previously is take the chemical structures and predict a variety of different physicochemical and biopharmaceutical properties. Properties like pKa, logP or logD, solubility, permeability, and use that information to predict in silico what would be the passive absorption, what would be the dissolution of drug along the GI tract. But we weren't able to predict the full exposure of compound, generate estimates of plasma and tissue concentration levels until we incorporated some estimation of the clearance of the compound. So based upon the work that we've done over the past year or so with these metabolism models, we've now integrated those CYP metabolism kinetic predictions inside of GastroPlus. And so today that marriage is strengthened. If you click next, Michael, what we're doing is taking what Michael has been talking about from ADMET Predictor, the QSAR models, click next, and merge them in with the PBPK models of GastroPlus, so that now from the chemical structures, click next, we can predict the full PK curves. We can start predicting how much compound is being metabolized by different CYP enzyme pathways in vivo. And we can start doing some very early screening for compounds, not only for absorption, but also for extraction in the gut, and also for early estimates of bioavailability. Click next. So the integration now with GastroPlus, for those of you who do have some experience with that program, as you'll recall, as you import chemical structures, you've always had this capability for many years to predict the physical-chemical properties. Now, on the right side of the import structure properties window, you have an ability, upon import of the structure files, to define a compartmental or whole body PBPK model, and then introduce some early estimates of clearance. The estimates for clearance, if you click next, could be the predictions of Vmax and Km for those 5 individual CYP enzyme pathways. Or, click next, we could utilize just a pure linear clearance estimated from these new HLM models for predicting intrinsic clearance. If you click next. Now, if we do decide to work with the individual predictions for Vmax and Km and introduce Michaelis-Menten kinetics into these PBPK models, there is an opportunity to see what scaling factors we use to convert those in silico or your measured in vitro Vmax Km values into the in vivo clearances. As Michael pointed out earlier in one of the slides, when we do a conversion from metabolic half-life measured in vitro, we utilize sometimes a conversion factor of 45 milligrams microsomal protein per gram liver tissue. By default in GastroPlus, that value is set to 38, but you as a user would have an opportunity to change that and use whatever conversion factor your lab feels most comfortable with. And then you'll be able to see, as you scroll through these different enzymes on the left, the various expression levels that we have found for human populations and the differences between American or Asian population groups, and in some cases also seeing some of this expression level data for preclinical species. Click next. In addition to predicting the enzyme kinetics, the clearance of the compound, predicting the full PK curves, plasma tissue concentration levels, another really exciting feature that we've been able to integrate with these new QSAR models from ADMET Predictor are the estimates of the FM percentages that would be utilized in your drug-drug interaction predictions. So as you import now structures into GastroPlus and you decide to utilize those enzyme kinetic models now available from ADMET Predictor, you will also have populated the DDI module, and you'll be able to see what are those FM percentages estimated within that CYP enzyme family, and then use that to do some very early assessment of any drug-drug interaction risks. That's a very popular topic today being promoted by regulatory agencies, and having this opportunity now to generate these predictions very early on, identifying any potential pitfalls or problems from chemical structure or utilizing your in vitro data, as you could always do, is a very nice extension to the GastroPlus PBPK models. So we're going to continue pushing forward this marriage between QSAR and PBPK as more data becomes available, hopefully expanding into new enzyme pathways so that you can continue to predict with confidence the exposure of compounds very early on. Michael?
Okay, thank you, John. One thing I forgot to do was actually demonstrate where these models are in ADMET Predictor. So I've just read in 62 compounds here. These are all known drugs. So in the PhysChem Bio section is the FUmic model down here on the end, and then the metabolism module, or the RCIPs are in the metabolism modules. Module. And what I did was I created 3 tabs kind of to illustrate some of these different models. So I created just a tab that has the pKa's for the compounds, and then the S log P, log D, the predicted FUmic, and then fraction cation. So our FUmic model contains 5 descriptors. F cation. Now, this is a descriptor that's the fraction of cationic species in the molecule. So for flecainide, this first example, if we look at the a plot of the fraction ionized versus pH, and we go up to here to about 7.4, we see that about 98% of the molecule is in the +1 state. So that's the fraction ionized, or the fraction cation given here as the descriptor. And so, we kind of use this, Austin used the pKa, and if it was above 7.4, it was if it had basic pKa above 7.4, then it was defined as a base. The fraction cation is actually a little bit better to predict that, because it doesn't just say, okay, everything's ionized at 7.4. It actually gives the fraction of that. If we sort the FUmic values, you'll see obviously the ones with very high log P or log D will have a low S+ predicted fraction unbound to liver microsomes, and then we can sort that the other way to see the ones that have a low or a high fraction unbound to microsomes, and these would be the low log P compounds, low log D also. And then this is simply a tab for our CYP substrate. So earlier I showed a plot of the percent of compounds that were metabolized by, or predicted to be substrates for different isoforms. And then finally on this tab, I know there's a lot of information here, but Km, Vmax, clearance for each one of the 5 major CYP metabolizing isoforms. And then on the end here is the HLM clearance for these compounds in the models. Okay, so in this final section, I'll just describe our ADMET Predictor KNIME workflow. So I downloaded the latest version of KNIME. This is free software. It was version 2.11.3. For our workflow, you need to install a few KNIME nodes, and that's the Chemaxon and Vernalis, just a couple examples. The installation manual shows the other ones that need to be installed. To determine what's installed, you can go to the Help Install menu, and then you can download these various nodes by selecting a particular site to download them from. The next step is to import our ADMET Predictor 7.2 workflow into KNIME. You import this zip file, and then this will appear in your local workspace. The node needs to be configured. So first thing you need to do is select your input file. We can read SMILES files, SD, and multiple mol files within the interface. And then you also need to show where the program where the ADMET Predictor executable exists. And then you simply select execute and open views, and it will create a table of the results. So here's the workflow, here's the reader over here, the batch predictor where all the ADMET predictions are performed, and then finally an interactive table. And so I'll just briefly show some of the features within that interface. So here's a KNIME, and you would just go to install new software. First, I'll show what I've got installed. As you can see, it's got the Axon node, and then these Vernalis nodes down here. And then you can predict, or you can select a particular site and then search in here for the particular nodes that are required for ADMET Predictor. And this takes a little bit of time to kind of connect to the site and download some of the stuff, so I'm not going to show that part. Then the next thing to do is just import our KNIME workflow. We select it from this archive file, and then you're going to browse to the ADMET Predictor directory and select this zip file here, open it up, and then this will import it into your local workspace. So now the node is defined, and then here we need to configure this and select the input file. By default, we've selected an SD file. I'm going to change that to a Smiles file, and then go to a particular area on my disk where I hold this Smiles file. So I'm just going to select Demo 2D and then click OK. So that's read that in there. And then the next thing to do is configure the node and point to where ADMET Predictor is. So that's going to be in C, Users, Public Simulations Plus, and then the ADMET Predictor 7.2 tree, and then I'll select that. So then the default here is to create a table and show the output. You can also export SD files. This is associated with our pKa predictions here, and so you can also output SD files using some of these other nodes. And then the other thing to do is just simply execute this and open the workflow. So the first thing it's doing is reading, then it's doing the predictions in ADMET Predictor, and it's queued these predictions up here, and then finally the table will come up with the results, and then we can view the structures in this tab. Let me just make these a little bit bigger. And so you would get a similar table to what's produced in ADMET Predictor, but using the KNIME workflows here. Okay. All right. So in summary, we've created 2 new models into ADMET Predictor 7.2. FUmic model predicts the fraction unbound to microsomes, and then the MET HLM total clearance predicts the unbound, and that's very important that you adjust your experimental values for the unbound fraction in there. We have updated all 18 cytochrome P450 kinetics models. We've improved the integration with GastroPlus PBK models, and we've also added a new KNIME workflow. So ADMET Predictor is available for a 3-week evaluation. So you can just go to our website and fill out a form to get an evaluation copy of ADMET Predictor. I'm going to be in Glasgow, Scotland for the ISXX meeting in June 22nd through the 25th. So if you're at this meeting, please come by and stop by booth number 206, and we can talk. And then Simulations Plus will also be at the ISC 18th International Conference on Drug-Drug Interactions in Seattle, Washington at the end of this month. So John, can I turn it back over to you?
Thank you, Michael. Once again, if you'd like to ask a question using your telephone, please use the hand-raising icon on your control panel and be sure to enter your unique audio PIN. So we do have a few questions that came in written, and so I'd like to go through those. The first one is, how do you include spontaneous degradation of compound into the CLint models if it is very unstable?
That's a good question. I would think that if it was really just chemically unstable, you could test that outside the CLint experiment. So I think you'd want to know if the compound was just chemically unstable initially without doing the CLint experiment. So we, as far as the data we collected, we don't know how chemically stable they are. I kind of assumed that they were just chemically stable in the environment itself. You might be able to see that from maybe when you do the fraction unbound in liver microsomes, you're doing a dialysis experiment, and in order to get the fraction unbound without metabolizing the compound, you simply don't add NADPH to the mixture. So you might be able to see some of the degradation there at that stage. But we did not kind of look into the molecules themselves. We just assumed, whoever was publishing this knew that these were chemically stable.
Thank you, Michael. I think you also made a comment earlier in the presentation about the fact that we had to utilize true quantitative measurements of intrinsic clearance as part of the model building process. So if something spontaneously degrades and it's very unstable, most likely there's going to be some sort of qualitative estimate of what that clearance might be, and that would not then be included at all in the training set when we go and build the models.
That's a good point. Yeah, the clearance measurements. So if it just degrades in under a minute and all of it's gone, that's going to be a very high clearance, and we'll probably have a greater than symbol in front of the value for the clearance.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Another question. The fraction unbound values might change between adults and pediatrics. Can we scale FU-MIC from adults to pediatrics if the HLMs are obtained from adults?
Very good question. I don't know. So the microsomes, I guess, would be different for the pediatrics. I haven't seen any scale factors or any mention of that, but that seems like that would be interesting to investigate if you're studying pediatric metabolism.
Yeah, I think I would just add a comment here. We know that with the Austin approaches for estimating the fractions unbound in microsomes, there is going to be a dependency on the concentration of microsomes in vitro in the incubation mixture. And if you have some idea about any differences between an adult and pediatric assay in terms of that microsomal content, that potentially could be utilized to scale FU-MIC. I don't think there's anything in our QSAR models themselves, the new ones we've developed, that would account for that. Also, if we're thinking about pediatric models in terms of the physiologically based PK systems, the GastroPlus program does have some considerations for adjusting the fractions unbound in plasma based upon differences in plasma protein levels between adult and pediatric groups. So that kind of correction is automatically handled. I don't believe, though, that the QSAR models that we've developed would automatically scale from adults to pediatrics. There could be, though, an opportunity to do that scaling using the Austin method. And sorry for the short plug, but we will be talking more about special considerations when doing pediatric PBPK modeling on June 22nd as part of the GastroPlus user group webinar series. So stay tuned for the invitation to register for that webinar, which should be coming out within the next day or so. Okay, another question. If we do the microsomal stability study, do you recommend to utilize 1 milligram per milliliter concentration of microsomes in the incubation mixture?
I think the standard's 0.5 milligram of microsomal protein per milliliter, so that's what I would use. That's what absorption system used, and that seems like kind of the standard. And actually, it depends how many compounds you're going to test, but it would be, interesting to see the variation between maybe 0.1 and 1 milligram. And so if you could do experiments at 2 different concentrations, maybe even 3, I think that could provide additional information. But I think the standard's 0.5 milligram per milliliter.
Thank you, Michael. Another question, do you plan to include clearance predictions for the substrates of non-CYP enzymes such as FMO, MAO, etc. in the future?
That would be great if we could get, appropriate data sets for those. So that's something that, comes up, as a request quite a bit, and we just need to investigate the data sets for those and see what we can extract. But that certainly would be helpful models.
Thank you, Michael. I agree, and I just would also add that if there are any opportunities to collaborate on the development of those models, please, we're always interested in discussing those opportunities. As Michael mentioned, for us, data is gold, and we'll try and find as much information as we can from public sources. But if there is data that you have been generating in your lab and you think there are opportunities to potentially share that for building models for these new enzyme pathways, please feel free to reach out to either Michael or I. Another question, so let's say that there are multiple CYPs predicted for the substrate. Obviously, in the case of 90% and above, you could just use one CYP, assuming metabolism for the other CYPs are negligible. But what if there are instances where CYP percentages are 70 to 80%? Would you determine clearance for both CYPs in total, or would you still take clearance only for the CYP with the greatest likelihood of binding the substrate?
I would use them all. If you're doing a simulation in GastroPlus, these just get automatically imported and used in the simulation. And I think if we go back to one of your slides here, so if it's metabolized by 3A4, you're going to get some metabolism in the gut, which I guess is that's what this is showing here over on the right. So there's a higher percent of 3A4 in the gut than any of the other isoforms. So if it's metabolized by 3A4, you're going to get some gut metabolism. So I would just include all of the predictions, no matter what the percentages were in there.
Thank you, Michael. The last question here is, we are currently working with QSAR models in cancer, diabetes, and few infectious disease areas such as malaria and Ebola. In your opinion, how could GastroPlus simulations help us to perform better screening or identify a good lead from the in silico inputs?
I think that's for you, John, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I think I'll handle this one. The QSAR models provide a lot of value for predicting specific endpoints. So, for example, predicting logP, solubility, permeability, metabolism stability. What we can do with a physiologically based PK model like GastroPlus is integrate all of these individual predictions, these individual dimensions, within the context of a physiologically based model to understand and appreciate what are the relationships between dissolution, absorption, metabolism, and pharmacokinetics, and get an idea about whether or not we may have some issues in vivo with our compound's ability to dissolve, with our compound's ability to absorb, with our compound's ability to be metabolized, and so forth. So I think the individual property predictions are useful for looking at one piece of the puzzle. And then the in silico simulations, PBPK models with GastroPlus, put all of those pieces together in the context of a physiology so that you can begin to appreciate how one of those individual properties or processes impacts the other. And that can help to guide some of the experimental activities that you're going to do downstream. It can help you focus on the specific area which seems to be limiting with respect to your compound's exposure.
Yep, so that's very good. I think, you can screen more compounds in ADMET Predictor, hundreds of thousands of compounds, predictive properties, and then filter down. So maybe you can use virtual compounds. Then once you've narrowed this down and into maybe hundreds of compounds, you can perform some batch GastroPlus simulations using the in vitro predictions from ADMET Predictor and calculate some of these things that John has identified. So fraction absorbed, this is fraction absorbed into the portal vein, and you can see that the difference between these two numbers here is that there's some metabolism going on in the gut wall, and then this is the fraction absorbed after the liver, the oral bioavailability. Excuse me, not fraction absorbed. The oral bioavailability is 48% predicted for this compound. So if you're doing simulations and we predict an oral bioavailability of 1%, that might be, and you had another compound that was predicted high, you would want the compound that's predicted high, maybe to scale up and go into some other models, rat models or whatever, for your particular drug development.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Michael, thank you once again for the very excellent and insightful discussion. That concludes today's webinar. If you missed any part of today's presentation, the playback will be available within the next 1 to 2 days at our website, www.simulations-plus.com.